Because otherwise in business, everyone is out there to get you. Everyone has the self-interest to derive most out of you using minimum amount of resources on their own. I feel even things like music festivals where people come together to celebrate a particular band, they're indistinguishable from religion. And even things like futurists who really rally behind new technologies, like, say, the fan following of Elon Musk. It is not different from religion. I do not think any particular social media or any particular company can be held responsible. Our food is dominated by processed food, sugar, and so on. And there's so many industries that are optimized to keep us addicted. Now, will you hold everyone responsible, or will you hold our own psychology, our own lack of putting the right democratic procedures in place responsible? It's easy to deflect blame, but I think a lot of blame, we need to introspect whether we deserve it. The mainstream theory is called the handicap theory. The theory goes that it exists precisely to exhibit that the peacock is so strong, it doesn't fear predators. And that's why that peacock attracts peahen attention. I remember as a CEO, I had gotten an executive coach, and he said, the value you're creating is entirely dependent on your mind. You're not like laying bricks or making furniture and so on. Everything you are doing is through your mind. If your job depends on your mind, then your mind has to be number one priority. I think the same concept, for example, in Indian marriages, they are grand and extravagant. And I think the bride and groom and their families don't even enjoy it because they're always busy in organizing. So why do they exist?
And he mentioned larger weddings where the gathering is a big number and it's a more of a lavish affair. Weirdly enough, they tend to last longer. Yeah. He said the takeaway from that isn't that you should make sure that you're spending lots of money and inviting lots of people to make sure that you're going to have a very long-lasting marriage. But I think one of the things it would be fun to kickstart with is a book both you and I admire, which is Elephant in the Brain by Robin Hanson and Kevin Simler. Why don't we discuss why is it that even our most altruistic or virtuous behaviors are largely a cover? They're actually disguised for our ulterior motives.
That book does provide a very different way to look at human behavior. And I mean, my sense of what the book was saying, there are ulterior motives that drive us, but on the surface, it appears as something else. For example, when you talk about religion, if you ask people, why are you religious? I think they will talk about, say, things like they believe in God. Everyone has a very emotional reason for why they believe in religion. But I think there's a different angle to looking at it. One way to think of why people associate themselves with religious groups is because they give them social belonging. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason for getting associated with a group. But I don't think we realize it when we are doing it, and we need a reason to feel good about ourselves. And that's why we talk about God and so on and so forth. And if you think from first principles, of course, different religions teach different teachings. So they have to be contradictory and they have to be in conflict. If you remove yourself from being embedded in religion and see it from a high level point of view, you have to admit it. Not all of them can be correct simultaneously. And that points to the fact that the reason people are associated with religion is not because of what religion says. So in that sense, I feel even things like music festivals where people come together to celebrate a particular band, they're indistinguishable from religion. And even things like futurists who really rally behind new technologies, like, say, the fan following of Elon Musk. It is not different from religion. Their specific beliefs might be different, but I think it's the same dynamics that are driving the behavior.
So it's a way of almost signaling to your tribe how loyal you are to that particular ethos or ideology, whatever group that might be.
Signaling is everywhere. I recall in that book, they were talking about healthcare, which again, a lot of us believe that it's the actual intervention that doctors do, which makes a difference. And I think that's true to a large extent. I don't think there is any denying that particular interventions do work. But I think there's also an aspect that gets missed, which is all about our feeling of getting cared for from like a healthcare system point of view. That motive, again, incentivizes everyone to over-medicate, to intervene when intervention is not needed. So if you start believing that what we pay for is being cared for, the feeling that other people or society cares for us, that starts explaining a lot of behaviors that we see in healthcare. Because then if the right thing to do is to not to intervene and let the person heal by himself or herself, nobody's incentivized to do that because that will be mistaken for not caring.
One of the areas that the book touched on was within healthcare, was the palliative care domain specifically. In palliative care, lots of people, they will, whether it's relatives of the patient or whether it's like hospital systems, they are willing to go ahead and provide very expensive care, which it almost doesn't matter whether it's effective or not. Because from the relative's point of view, you want to be shown that you are caring and you're doing everything that you can towards the terminal stages of your loved one's life, that you want to show your affinity towards them, that attachment towards them. And your primary motive is to make sure that you are there for them.
And I think it also points to the disparity in terms of where the attention of pharma companies, medical industry is allocated. A lot of research goes into oncology, where the lifespan that, say, a new cancer drug would extend is probably a few weeks or months. So I find it not that quite odd that we're willing to spend so much of time in extending life at the terminal stage by a few weeks, while we are mostly ignorant of the years of decades of actually interventions that can happen when we are healthy to reduce the risk of chronic disease.
It seems to reflect, in addition to the signaling mechanisms, more of a short-termist curative approach that typically one sees towards medicine, as opposed to thinking on a longer term horizon and being more preventative and proactive in those areas.
Partly us patients or us non-medical people are to also blame, because I don't think we realize, how do you even measure wellness? If you are sick and someone removes that sickness, you thank them. But if someone keeps you healthy for a long period of time, I think we sense that probably not much effort is getting put in, because nothing is changing. And that's precisely the point. Nothing should change when you're healthy. And if that takes effort, I don't think we attribute the results to that effort. And that's why probably people don't go to gyms as often, don't get trainers, don't pay attention to nutrition, because we only attribute effort when there is a visible change. But a lack of change is not something we care about.
There is a proverb or a saying, and I don't know exactly where it's from, but in a particular culture or a society, the doctor is only paid on the days when...
There's a practice in China. I think I remember the time period, probably 1800s or earlier. Doctors are paid when you're healthy, but they have to treat you when you're sick without getting paid.
I don't know if I've ever seen it actually implemented as a sort of business idea, but I've read about it often where one proposes someone should start a gym and you take the payment upfront for the month or the year. And each time the person attends the gym, you pay them a small fraction of their money back. Whether that's feasible or how that runs, I'm not entirely sure, but it reflects that sort of shift in how you think about these things.
Yeah. So I do think there is a ton of scope in experimenting with how do you align incentives. It's really a user experience problem to a certain extent, because the information is out there. I think everybody knows fat is bad, or being overweight, obese is bad. If you eat sugar, you can get diabetes. I think it's common knowledge, but how do you translate it so that people are incentivized to exhibit behaviors which reduce these risks? I think it's a big user experience problem, not really a knowledge problem or a research problem. There's a lot of scope for experimenting with when do you nudge, how do you nudge, what do you communicate, what do you not say?
Yeah, precisely. I think it's not really a research problem or a knowledge problem, in the sense that we all, at a personal and individual level, right? We know that when we're eating something, we know whether it's good for our health or bad.
Exactly.
We know every time you skip out on physical activity, this is not ideal, but still somehow on numerous occasions, we get in this repetitive cycle where we've developed these far from ideal habits. And I think one of the areas we struggle with is this concept of us being a community unto ourselves. If I think of myself as Jas in the present moment now, in some ways, to ensure that I live in good health, I should do absolutely everything possible to ensure that the future Jas of 5 years from now, I have some responsibility towards that individual to make sure that I'm in good habits. But being able to, again, think out to that long-term horizon, it seems to be incredibly difficult, when in actual fact, I think time and time again in our lives, whether it's health related or in other areas, we always say, 5 years ago, I should have done that. Or 3 years ago, if I had started this, today it would be like this. And I knew I should have done that, but I didn't. So even though we know those life lessons, it's still such a struggle to implement it for the future version of ourselves.
Yeah, I love this concept. Like you said, the community of ourselves. I think it's important to recognize that the future you is a different person who can end up regretting the choices the present you is making. Although everyone's interest is aligned and they are connected causally, but it's not that whatever you're feeling right now will magically project 5 years in future. And I think that's why regrets exist. So really thinking of you having a responsibility for the future you, I think that's a good mental model to have.
signaling and that particular concept. In your sort of personal life, whether it's been building a business in the world of startups, how have you seen signaling play out in certain examples over there?
I think the kind of signaling I have ended up appreciating is, I think, what's called as honest signal, costly signal, and it manifests in different contexts, right? For example, in the case of, say, peacocks, where they have this large spread of feathers, colorful, which attracts predator attention. And the mainstream theory goes, although there's certain debate, which is called the handicap theory, the mainstream theory goes that it exists precisely to exhibit that the peacock is so strong, it doesn't fear predators, and that's why that peacock attracts peahen attention. In the similar way, I think in the business, when I was starting out, I didn't appreciate that many of the things that are getting exhibited are actually simply these honest signals. For example, I think the prominent example is the amount of money companies spend in branding, which is, say, putting billboards, or in B2B case, going to events, or even something as simple as investing a lot of money into getting a professionally designed website. Now, if you think about from a naive point of view, if you have a website, its purpose is to give information. So why can't you have information just displayed like it's displayed in the text file? But people would pay big agencies hundreds and thousands of dollars to produce very well-polished websites, polished videos. Earlier, I used to think that I don't have to invest all this. I can get away with doing a cheap job that communicates the same thing. But I think the keyword is cheap. Precisely, people are able to guess if you've put a lot of money in getting a website design. I think people are able to guess that the company has resources to be able to waste it on something that doesn't really matter. And that actually drives people's confidence. So one of the big learnings was the value in beautiful design is precisely in the fact of being able to give an honest signal that I have so much of resources that I can afford to waste money on beauty and not functionality. So that's something I've come to appreciate. And now we invest a lot of time in giving this costly signal, because otherwise in business, everyone is out there to get you. Everyone has this self-interest to derive most out of you using minimum amount of resources on their own. Eventually, I think the whole ecosystem starts incentivizing businesses that give these costly signals. So that's why you'll see waste everywhere, expenditure. Companies throw big amount of money into, say, parties. They would throw into expensive PR consultants. You see waste in business. Yeah, it is likely that the part of it is just honest signaling.
From an outsider's perspective, this can all seem, as you said, wasteful and pointless or irrelevant, but really it's the collateral after effects of a very necessary process. And as you were saying that, it reminds me of the concept of proposing, the idea of buying a diamond ring. You're bringing something quite materialistic into a very sort of emotionally meaningful ecosystem of a relationship of love between two individuals.
I think the same concept, for example, in Indian marriages, they are grand and they're extravagant. And I think the bride and groom and their families don't even enjoy it because they're always busy in organizing. So why do they exist? And I think it's nothing but signaling. Signaling that the match is so good, they are willing to spend a good amount of their life savings and burn it essentially. It's in the crypto world, they say burning of tokens, that they vanish. And similarly, they're saying we love each other so much that we're willing to burn and invite so many people to exhibit this burning of money that we are held accountable to be there for a long time.
There was, weirdly enough, you may be familiar with Professor John Vervaeke. He's essentially someone who's done quite a lot of work into the meaning crisis, and he speaks about this sort of topic from various different lenses: psychology, cognitive sciences, anthropology, etc. He was just speaking about correlations, and he mentioned larger weddings where the gathering is a very big number and it's more of a lavish affair. Weirdly enough, they tend to last longer. And he said the takeaway from that isn't that you should make sure that you're spending lots of money and inviting lots of people to make sure that you're going to have a very long-lasting marriage. But he said the other factors involved in there is that you probably have greater number of social connections. There's more sort of financial stability in that world of yours, and you're connected in those ways. And so that inadvertently ends up meaning that your marriage is able to last longer because it's able to defend itself against some of those variables.
Yeah, something I don't think I appreciated 10 years back. And in that sense, I feel there are several levels of rationality. I think the first level is that's super obvious, where you do not account for all the second level effects of what you're doing. So in the sense, if you're taking marriage, the most rational thing is to not even go to the court. Why get the government involved? You just start living together. That's like the super level zero rationalist answer. The second one would be maybe if you go one level more, and talk about that. Maybe getting government involved is a good idea, because marriages, they have, say, ups and downs, and you don't want to really throw your hands up whenever there is like a slight downward phase. So getting separation difficult by getting the government involved could be like a good idea. And that's where going to the court and getting it done makes sense. But the second level is, like you said, getting the society involved, wherein you, by inviting all of them and throwing like a party, you're guaranteeing that you have all sorts of social support to make sure you have a healthy and happy sort of marriage ahead. So I think 10 years back, I was on level 0, but I've graduated to appreciate that our culture and our evolution, it has so many hidden forces going in, that there is always some level of benefit from different traditions that have evolved over a period of time. I think I used to throw them under the bus, but slowly I'm coming to appreciate that different traditions and different cultures, they play a role which may be quite hidden.
As you're saying that, I was smiling because I think I've been on a very similar trajectory. I think a few years ago, the hyper rationalist me would have scoffed at a lot of these things and almost had this snobbish attitude at, this is what, if I could go out a step, say, this is what sort of unintelligent individuals do. And then obviously life has a way of humbling you through various experiences. And then you slowly start to unlock the value, or you're able to maybe just open your perspective a bit more and realize, actually, there is a lot of rationality in these practices. And I think rationalists, they suffer from this particular disorder where they assume that we have reached the end stage of cognitive intelligence, in the sense where we're able to look back and deride individuals for certain practices. And in certain scenarios, there were many practices which were very questionable, and it's good we don't engage in them still. But I think we also forget that potentially in 100 or a few hundred years from now, I'm not sure what exactly the arc of humanity will look like, but they will also look back and scoff at some of the practices that we engage in. So we're far from like the finished article along this sort of evolutionary chain.
Yeah. On that note, again, say 10 years back, I would look at politics or bureaucrats and I'd say they are incompetent. And that was like a supremely naive view disguised as a rationalist superiority. But now I think I've realized that if I were in their shoes, I'll probably behave the same, because it's the system and the incentives within systems that drives the behavior. And I think we are far too liberal in attributing something to an individual behavior, which is really just a product of the system they are in. And appreciating that context is becoming more and more important as I grow in life. And similarly, people say poor behave this way or rich behave this way, and people hate on billionaires, for example. And I'm pretty sure anyone who's hating on billionaire, if they were a billionaire themselves, they would behave exactly like the person they're hating. Having that appreciation is important, because otherwise you'll always be having a false sense of superiority and not appreciation for the actual truth.
This sort of actually segues into what I wanted to speak about next, was chasing status, looking at that lens from mimetic desire. How is it that we crave status, and what kind of status games do we play, whether in the professional realm, in the personal realm, depending on which sort of strata of the socioeconomic rung of society you belong in? And I know you've written a few threads on this as well.
Status seeking behavior is, I think, so ingrained from like an evolutionary point of view, as we belong to the primate family. So, and it is like a very socially hierarchical society. You take like any primates and they're very socially organized. So I think there's no doubt at all that we are always trying to get up the hierarchy. I think that's just the way we are. So there is no denying to it. It manifests in very different ways. And I think that's the whole beauty of culture. And I do think whatever we say about, say, Maslow's hierarchy, there is like a good element of truth to it, which is as long as our physiological needs are satisfied, we are not feeling threat for our survival, immediately we get in the mode of maximizing status. And I think most consumer businesses have optimized to extract most status-seeking behaviors from us. So be it Instagram, be it Snapchat, I think all of them slowly and steadily, almost like a machine learning model that goes to gradient descent, they've optimized to push the right buttons so that we are able to satisfy our sense of seeking status. It's so pervasive that it's just hard to even see where not to figure out status seeking. I think right from even non-profit, government, to politics, to businesses, to celebrities, it's just always like behind our primary motive as the hidden motive.
I remember that you had written about developing an immunity to mental health problems. And you've also spoken a bit about meditation and your personal experience. So would love to hear a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what we were talking about, that we tend to seek cures when things go really bad. And it's mystery and an unfortunate circumstance that mental health is not taught unless you're diagnosed as depressed or your anxiety is like when things are too late, only then people talk about things like meditation, cognitive behavior therapy, and so on and so forth. I believe, on the contrary, that you should adopt healthy behaviors then you're most healthy, because that's where you build immunity towards all sorts of conditions. I remember as a CEO, I had gotten like an executive coach. And he had asked me whether I do meditation, and I said no. And he said, the value you're creating is entirely dependent on your mind. You're not like laying bricks or making furniture and so on. Everything you are doing is through your mind. So your mental health has to be a number one priority. Even if like you're physically maybe not fit, but if your job depends on your mind, then your mind has to be number one priority. And that sort of was an aha moment for me, that I had been completely ignoring it, even though I wasn't feeling anxious or depressed. But that's when I discovered that meditation exists. I started doing meditation even before any sort of bouts of depression. I started reading about cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive biases that can end up making you depressed. So I actually learned a ton about mental health while I was okay mentally. And I do think that's helped me. For example, all the practices, meditation practice, cognitive behavior therapy, principles, and so forth, I think that provides a framework for me to catch my negative emotions way earlier and handle them versus letting them balloon into something much bigger and getting incapacitated because of those things. So I highly recommend everyone to learn about cognitive behavior therapy, start meditating, and generally read about mindfulness and what good mental health is way before they have any sort of sense of depression, anxiety, or sadness.
And maybe just to flip this slightly, is there any particular sort of concept that you've come across, which was in this particular space, which was advocated as being quite helpful, but you yourself thought, this doesn't make sense to me, or I don't think this is particularly helpful? So just to give one example, it could be that obviously this is not the case, but I know that this has been the experience of certain other people that I've spoken to, where they've tried meditation and they have tried it, at varying durations, etc. And they've tried it for a certain period of time, but they've just come out and said it actually hasn't done much for me. And so whilst everyone has advocated for its benefits, they didn't particularly find it useful. Obviously, that's not the case with yourself, but are there any other such concepts or practices where you felt that to be the case?
Yeah, so I think meditation is such a big catch-all word that it really depends on what people mean by meditation. Sure. Some people literally put on music and sit outside, and that's listening to music. I don't call this as meditation. And similarly, I've personally found, say, guided meditations to be not very helpful. Because, and I think that's the way a lot of people start and associate meditation with, wherein there is like a narrator who's talking to you, who's telling you what to do, who's telling you to not have. I've done meditations where the narrator has said, bundle your emotions and think they're in a box, lock that box and forget about it. So that doesn't work for me at all. And so what really works for me is just silent meditation and focusing on breath. Because I felt that's trained me to be okay with my thoughts. Because when you're silently meditating without any voice, without any narration, you observe that so many thoughts pop in your head out of the blue, and you have an impulse to act on it. Sometimes you get an idea, a business idea, and you want to write it down. Sometimes you get a negative emotion and you want to really analyze it deeply. But if you're just left with your thoughts, I think you're trained to be okay with those thoughts to come and go while you're observing them as almost like a neutral observer. So that's helped me a lot, and narrative meditation hasn't really worked for me.
I think you've touched on something where a lot of people, when we talk about issues related with mental health, it's often about life is maybe difficult because I need to do this and I haven't done that. And I need to make sure I need to secure a good career. There has to be financial stability. Personal relationships have to be good, and many other aspects. So it's always about doing something. And I think meditation in and of itself teaches a lesson that actually sometimes doing nothing, being able to do nothing is very helpful, but it's also so damn difficult these days with just the number of distractions that are around. So whether it's a business idea that you might get that you're tempted to note down, or whether notifications going off on your phone, or whether it's your email. So at a personal level, but also from experiences from other people, it just seems that doing nothing is a real art and real skill that you have to try and train yourself towards to be able to actually successfully do it.
Yeah, and I started with literally 1 minute of doing nothing. And I think 1 minute of doing nothing is something that everyone can do. And if not 1 minute, try with 10 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever.
Right.
I think important thing is to build a habit of doing nothing. And over a period of time, 1 minute can extend to 2, 5, 10, even hours. And I think it's important because if you don't give space in your brain to be bored, you'll always be driven by impulses. And a lot of those impulses are actually, I think, ingrained and installed by someone else, like corporations, products, for their own benefit. So to be able to reflect and see what is that you are driven by, what is that makes you come alive, what is your love, you need to be by yourself without distraction from anyone else. And that's what meditation teaches you.
Have your meditation practices changed your relationship with social media consumption in terms of how much you're using it, how often you're using it, and in which way you're using it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's changed in a big way. For example, checking replies to my Twitter, say once a day or sometimes not even then. So even if there is some numbers written on the notifications icon, I'm totally okay with that. While before, I think as soon as there is like a 1 or 2 or 3, whatever number is written, you would leave to check what happened. So it has trained me to start ignoring many of the sort of hacks that different social media companies do to keep you engaged. I don't like scroll endlessly. I box my time to just writing tweets and not check. So it has made me much more conscious towards why is that? There's two things, right? One is you use social media because there's all sorts of patterns that make you use social media in a way that maximizes advertisement revenue. And the other is use social media because you derive benefits from it that are you've consciously chosen. I'm always striving to be in the latter camp. Otherwise, you'll be automatically giving revenue to whoever is able to hack into your brain. I see meditation as really this firewall to your brain to selectively choose information should enter and what information should exit.
There has been this narrative which has been gaining momentum over quite a few years now, and which is that social media is responsible for quite a few mental health disorders. I think some studies have validated that. You hear about that from politicians or certain advocacy groups, and that big tech is hacking your brain when it comes to using social media and social technologies. There's certainly some amount of truth to that, which I think cannot be denied. Do you think that actually all of this criticism is well deserved? Or has social media or social technologies in some extent become scapegoats, and that if it wasn't social media, it would perhaps be something else in its position?
Yeah, definitely in the latter camp. I don't think we can hold companies responsible for these things. Of course, companies will do what the law allows them to do. And it's our job to make sure there are checks and balances installed from a democratic process point of view. Because if Twitter doesn't do something and another social media can come along and people will migrate to it, if whatever social media is most addictive is by definition will get most advertisement, is by definition will get most revenue. So unless we change guidelines from like a government point of view, I do not think any particular social media or any particular company can be held responsible. In a similar way, for example, our food is dominated by processed food, sugar, and so on. And there's so many industries that are optimized to keep us addicted. Now, will you hold everyone responsible, or will you hold our own psychology, our own lack of putting the right democratic procedures in place responsible? It's easy to deflect blame, but I think a lot of blame, we need to introspect whether we deserve it.
So if I'm not misinterpreting, you're saying there are different layers at which responsibility has to be taken. So whether that's firstly at the individual level for the person using social media or these social technologies. Second is perhaps at the maybe corporate governance potentially, where companies will act within the letter of the law and maybe stretch and bend wherever they can, but will largely act within those parameters. And then thirdly, obviously, there is the government who is going to be dictating certain laws or regulations in how these companies can act. And each of them have to take some degree of attribution towards.
Right. Yeah. Something like, say, when seat belts were invented for cars, if I'm not mistaken, Volvo or Volkswagen invented it and they gave away the patent to everyone to install seatbelts. But even then, I think people were not ready to wear seatbelts until government came in and made that mandatory. This has to be like owned jointly and collectively. So we can't hold one entity responsible for such a big problem.
It reminded me of this particular anecdote where it's semi-related, but I think it shows maybe a different approach of getting mass adoption of certain behaviors. I can't remember which grocery store it was, but it was the first one that introduced shopping trolleys into the actual stores. But consumers were afraid of looking silly as being one of the few who were driving these giant shopping trolleys inside the store, and they didn't want to come across as looking foolish or idiotic. And so the company hired actors as consumers within the store to push around these shopping trolleys. When there was a significant number of them, it was suddenly seen to be as more normal behavior or conventional behavior.
Oh.
And that's opened up the floodgates to try and adopt that particular behavior amongst the general population. So it's interesting at which different levels and what different approaches you can take to try and drive these behaviors home.
Yeah. And shopping is still, I understand this, but when it comes to things we are addicted to, social media, sugar, or anything else out there, it's extremely difficult for, I think, any one company to be able to make the masses de-addicted, because they simply seek to satisfy their craving, their addiction somewhere else.
It's game theoretic in terms of if one company is not willing to do it, I'm sure someone else will be. And so they will eventually emerge out on top. Moving from here, I think, to a place which is of great interest to you, which is mental models. Obviously, you've written a book about it for founders. And I want to ask your opinion on the utility of mental models. But also in doing that, at what point do the risk-benefit ratio slightly tilt? So what I mean is, at what point does it become mental masturbation?
Right.
But when does that sort of switch happen? When does the utility stop?
The way I define mental model is like a map. And if you want to get to point A to point B, one way is to keep on trying random directions and hope you get to point B. So mental model, I think it's really about that. If you assume your territory is like this, the map has to be like this. So in that sense, I think it strips away a lot of complexity, because a map doesn't show you every little detail where one brick is or where one, say, a signpost is. It shows you just the complexity that you need to achieve a certain goal. So in that sense, it's very useful to enable you to focus on the essentials for a particular problem. Again, the flip side is some problems, as they say, are wicked problems, which is so complex that it's very hard to put like a logical structure on those problems. For example, elimination of poverty. So many people have tried it, and it's so interlinked with different factors that no single mental model, or perhaps even like a collection of mental models, can give you the context of the problem. So I think the art to using mental models really lies in appreciating what they leave out. And if you recognize whatever they're leaving out as relatively unimportant, then they're super useful tools, because they enable you to not get bogged down into unnecessary complexity. But if you're applying it to problems which are wicked problems, which are super complex, I think you will end up doing more damage than otherwise if you had not applied any mental model.
I'm aware we're coming down to the end. And so there's 100 other things in my mind or questions that I have for you. And this probably could go on and on. But I just want to say a big thank you for making time, coming down, and just sharing your thoughts and insights.
Yeah, I've enjoyed conversing on all topics under the sun. These are the things I've enjoyed thinking about, writing about. So really appreciate you taking time out, doing research and doing this conversation with me.
Before I let you go, do you think in India, whether it's in the startup world or just generally in society, are there any particular ideas that you wish were more known? For example, maybe you read a book and you thought that, I wish this book was read by more people, simply because of the value that it unlocks. Or this particular concept, I wish just 20 people more understood this, because it could be so useful.
Yeah, I think the art of thinking better, and that is a multidimensional subject. No book captures it, although I feel some book can be written, but it is a subject in itself. Like we were talking about different levels of rationality, exposing people to cognitive biases, telling them how statistics can mislead, and even mindfulness and meditation into it. So I think compressing how do you think better, and not better in a hyper rationalist way that we were talking about, but better in the sense of achieving your goals and living a happy, peaceful life. I think good cognitive processes, thinking styles play a big role in helping you live a much healthier, happier life that you desire. And that's something I think is missing. And I wish more and more people pursued their desire to be able to be better thinkers.